Welcome back to the Hot Flash Diaries podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Caceres, and today's episode is focused on the topic of staying strong in midlife, including that of fitness and nutrition tips for women going through perimenopause and menopause. And I couldn't have thought of a better guest than that of Greg Hetherington. Greg is a McGill University alum and a decorated athlete. He's played for the Canadian Football League for the BC Lions after being drafted by the Calgary Stampeders in 2007. Before his CFL career, he was a standout player for the McGill Redmen, where he built a reputation for his discipline and drive. Today, Greg is the owner and founder of Fuel Training Club in Toronto, a leading facility that is redefining what it means to live a healthy, balanced life, and we could not be happier to have him on here today. Welcome, Greg, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jess.
So Greg, tell us a little bit more about your background in terms of how you got into the world of training and the world of fitness. I mean, of course, it makes sense after your CFL career and being so, athletic your entire life. But tell us more about how that turned into wanting to own a fitness club and to help people live healthy.
Yeah, it started when I was younger. I've always been interested in athletics. I mean, I got a late start by today's standards in youth sports. I didn't begin playing team sports until 9, and really didn't do, I didn't play football competitively until my last year of high school. But I think what I've always had is a keen interest in how the body works. I had a kinesiology class in high school, which led to me getting a kinesiology degree in university, which is the study of human movement. And, that's just continued my journey on learning how can we optimize movement, lifestyle, but then, moving on to the business aspect of it. And I think, the combination of having that experience, knowledge, and expertise in the industry has led to, where Fuel Training Club is now. And also, we've moved into some youth programs to teach movement literacy there, and really not just the in-gym portion, but the lifestyle pieces you had mentioned as well.
Well, and that's what I love. I've had the pleasure of being to Fuel and learning about your facility. And also I had the pleasure of chatting with a group of women all about perimenopause and menopause. But what I love most about your facility is that when I walked in, it didn't feel intimidating. It felt really welcoming. It felt like anybody could go and not feel, that it wasn't right for them. So it was really exciting to see that, because a lot of gyms unfortunately don't have that same ambiance. So it's too bad you're a little far from where I am. Otherwise I'd be a regular goer, that's for sure. But tell us a little more about your work with women. Of course, you are training women of all ages and men as well, but specifically the work that you're doing with women who are in, the perimenopause, menopause, midlife stage of life, because of course we know that this is a very unique stage of life. A lot of women don't even know that they're in perimenopause as well. And we know that hormonal shift in terms of the decline of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, specifically estrogen and testosterone, are what's most impactful as far as bone strength is concerned, muscle strength, and the ability to build lean muscle and maintain that of lean muscle. So how do you work with women in that life stage to try to help them have that, health span? Again, that's something that we're going to talk a lot about in our next episode. I have the pleasure of having Dr. Fallis come on, which you know as well, who's a men's health expert, but talks a lot about longevity and living healthy. But again, that's really what you do, right? Is you're focused on helping people live healthy as long as they possibly can, and focused on their health span versus lifespan.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think everyone has the same idea of what health span is. And I define it as, the time that we can live injury and disease free. And I think, at Fuel Training Club specifically, and this might not be something that a lot of people consider when they go into gyms, especially group-based gyms. And it is the split. So we're about 55 to 45% women to men. Generally speaking, group fitness will skew in one direction or the other. So having that split sort of down the middle means that we cater almost evenly to both men and women. And I think, first acknowledging the fact that a man explaining menopause might come upon like, what can I provide? What insight can I provide? And I think the insight that I can provide comes from a practical experience, seeing some of these strategies implemented, but then also just, you should know your population that you're training. And I think, for us, we go mid-20s to what people in their mid-60s, right? And everywhere in between. So going through, we're often, the training team's often the first group to hear about someone's pregnancy before friends and family, right? It's a health concern. And it's something that you need to be aware of. And health risks aside for certain pregnancies, strength training and fitness is very important during that period. And, as it's getting more popular, or at least there's less stigma around discussing menopause, it's also important for men to understand that. So perimenopausal women who are in class, or menopausal women that are in a personal training session, they are more aware of some of the symptomatic experiences that they have and how we can better support women in this regard. So for us, strength training is equally important for men and women, but I do believe for women, with the risk, having a greater risk of osteoporosis, decreased bone density, naturally less muscle mass than men, it really does help improve quality of life and improve health span when you can increase or get a longer runway. As I explained, is the more that you can do in advance, the easier it is to maintain down the road, especially for women, but men too, is that it's very hard. It's not impossible. It's never too late to start. It's harder to develop bone density and muscle mass later on in life, especially as you're going through menopause. So if you can get started on that earlier, then it's going to be easier to maintain. And I think that's something that we try to communicate now that strength training has become more popular. I mean, we've always been a strength and conditioning facility, and we cater to a working professional. It's not elite athletes. Inherently, strength training has its risks. And I think a lot of the time people are concerned about those risks, but often I'll explain the risk of not exercising and strength training is much greater down the road than it is the minor, back tweak, or maybe you pulled something in your arm, then falling and breaking a hip, right? And was looking at some of the stats and in Canada, for instance, 85% of all injury related hospitalizations are falls. And when you look at the elderly population, the majority of those are women who end up falling and going to the hospitals. Now, I'm sure there's some studies outlining that, but I think one of the practical ways to look at it is if you have less muscle mass and you have lower bone density, right, then you're more susceptible to falling and breaking bones. So what can we do to help improve that? And I think, when you're in the gym, that's the 1 hour, let's say you're in there for 1 hour a day. What are you doing the other 23 hours that I think a lot of people overlook, but it's not that they're unaware. I mean, generally speaking, people know what's healthy and what isn't healthy. The concern isn't really, I think, the knowledge. If anything, it's analysis by paralysis. It's the action, is making the steps forwards to keep those habits and making them routine. So for us, communicating the importance of strength training, especially for women, is a big part of what we do.
And that's, brought up a lot of good points, in particular, again, that the importance of strength training for maintaining that lean muscle mass, but also being able to withstand certain injury. And we know, like you pointed out, breaking a hip for a woman who breaks the hip in her, postmenopausal days, we know that within a year, the mortality rate is extremely high. And if we can prevent that from happening, that's what we want to do, right? That's why it's so important. I mean, hormones are an important part too, in the sense of preventing fractures, because we know that estrogen helps to build bone itself, but an elastic type of bone, not a bone that is going to break easily when you fall. So it can withstand some of that impact, but it's the muscle around, it's all of your agility, your ability to prevent even having that body, contact on the floor. You're instead being able to get up out of chairs, without using your arms, and use that core strength and all of these things that are going to prevent us from really having, a detrimental fall that could lead to, death within a year. Those stats are scary, but unfortunately very real. And I've unfortunately seen it over and over again in my career over the last 25 years being in, the medical world. So that's really, an important thing to talk about. And you're right. I mean, what you do when you go home for those 23 hours, I mean, it's great that you get up and go for an hour at the gym, but you're right. Are you consistently staying, within that, achieving what the goals that you're trying to achieve, right? By all of the things, are they in alignment with what you're trying to do? And it is tough. Most of us know what we need to do. You're right. But it's hard. It's hard some days, right? But trying to make it part of your routine is really important. And I think there's easy things that can be done, like really things like there's been a lot of discussion around the use of of weighted vests, for example, for women when they're going out for walks, throwing on a weighted vest and being able to sort of maintain some lean muscle mass that way. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how does a woman go about choosing the right weight for her body type or her goals?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna back up and come right back to that because I think rucking or walking with a weight vest is an excellent way. Dare I use the word hack because I feel like hacks infer shortcuts, which it could go on another tangent. But I do believe that it's a great way to stack habits, and I'm going to come back to that one. And first, the way that I look at all when I say problem, when I look at what's the problem we're trying to solve. So what is it that, in specifically, if we're going to generalize, women have as they get older, we look at bone density. Obviously, there's going to be the hormonal changes, which could impact insulin sensitivity, and then muscle mass. So if we're going to focus on those three, because those seem to be the big differentiators between men and women, then I'm looking at what are those goals? Always, what is it that you want to achieve? Then I look at how much time do you have to achieve those goals? And once you're realistic with how much time you have, then you have to look at how much time you're willing to put forwards. And those often aren't the same. And I think that's an important part because someone might say, well, I've got 7 hours a week I can dedicate to exercise, but are you going to actually dedicate those 7 hours? And is it practically possible for you to do that? If you've got kids, if you're going on vacation, you have to factor in, you're not going to have 7 days a week of 1 hour all the time. So when we look at the average person, let's say they can dedicate 2 to 3 hours of fitness. What are some of the things that you can spend time on that have the biggest impact? Peter Attia coined this term that I really liked is people focusing or majoring in the minor. And when you look at the things that people think have a big impact that don't really have that big of an impact, and you put all your attention to it, say like collagen supplementation or creatine or multivitamins, there is no single pill that's going to solve osteoporosis and insulin sensitivity. Now, from an optimization standpoint, these are some areas that can help with your health span optimization, but we want to major in the important parts. And I look at that as, if you're not sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night, and I understand that this is an average, and napping can contribute to that, and hormonal changes are going to impact sleep. But if you're not working towards that, if you're not strength training or strength and conditioning more days than not during the week, so let's say 4 out of 7 days a week. One of my favorites, if you're not consuming 1 gram of protein per pound of target body weight, right, and you're not managing chronic life stress, like these are the 4 pillars that I look at. If I'm going to help someone out, are you working on these 4 first and foremost? And if the answer is, well, I could sleep more, I could strength train more, I could eat better, I could reduce stress, then that's where we should focus. So your question about the weight vest would fall under from a strength training standpoint. So if you look at that person's goal of improving health span and they've got 3 hours per week, one of when I say easy, I mean it is a convenient thing to do, is if you've got a weight vest or a rucksack, which is a backpack with weights in it, you can go for a walk. And although I wouldn't say that I am against walking for exercise, I would just argue that for most people, it's not an intense enough amount of exercise to warrant change. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not beneficial, but it does mean that if you are looking to improve, let's say some markers of, and when I say performance, it is something that correlates to health span, like VO2 max, your oxygen capacity, your overall strength. If you're not exercising at an intensity that is going to challenge these markers, then it's, you're either remaining the same or you're not getting ahead of the curve, which means that you're actually, over time, you're going to see a decrease. So we're walking with a weight vest, and I'll just refer to it as rucking. It really, if we were to talk about rucksacks, what to wear, I mean, for women, you have to consider that a weight vest is going to sit on your breasts. So if you've got something that's coming down onto the front of your chest, you might consider the backpack, which is just putting the weights in your back. I can't speak on that from experience. I've spoken to some who've gotten weight vests, but I can say, as someone, I ruck myself, and it's something that I would, if I'm going to go out, I have a dog. So if I'm going to walk my dog, that's an easy thing to just throw on my back. So the habit of walking my dog is stacked with the activity of putting the bag on my back. And the implications of that are, by walking with weight on your shoulders, you are helping. It's a more, when I say impactful, I mean literally, there's more impact in that exercise, which will help with bone density. It might not increase bone density for a lot of people, but it'll help reduce the loss of bone density. And it'll therefore help supplement your strength training. because although it is more impact than walking, it's not high impact like, let's say, plyometrics are or jumping. So by strength training, adding the rucking, I think it's a great supplemental activity that you could add on to the 3 hours that you have a week. If your 3 hours includes 1 hour of rucking, then the other 2 hours that you have are going to have to be fairly high intensity in order to really to elicit that change. So I know there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll leave it there for questions before I continue the rant.
So, well, that's a great point. And I never thought of the challenges with, breasts and wearing a weighted vest. I have not invested in a weighted vest yet, but that was something that I have on my list to do for this year. So a backpack sounds really reasonable, and almost everyone has a backpack, right? Borrow your kids if you have to. How do you know what weights to throw in there? Like how much is too much? What's an appropriate way of figuring that out?
Well, the good thing about that is if you're taking your kid's backpack, or let's say your old, whatever backpack you have, you're probably not going to want to put more than 15, maybe 20 pounds at most. Otherwise, it's going to feel like the seams are going to break. So right. I think for most people, it's going to be that's fine. I would start small. So I made the mistake of thinking, oh, okay, I can put on, I weigh 210 pounds. So putting, 40 pounds on my back didn't feel, I always look at from a percentage of body weight, right? So, if I'm doing 20% of my body weight or something, I should be fine. But it really, you don't realize when you think of every step you take as a rep, right? And if you're doing, let's say, a 5,000 step walk and, just under, let's say under 4 kilometers, let's say, it's 5,000 reps. And if you were to say, I want you to do 5,000 lunges right now, your legs would probably be sore for a long time, right? So, you want to be, yeah, exactly. You've got to build up slowly. So I would, start with 5 pounds for your first walk. And again, it would also depend, is this individual already walking? So if someone's already walking, right, then yeah, start with 5 pounds. Then the next one, try 10 pounds, and then just use how you feel as a guide. And then, you'll get up to a point where once you get to 20 pounds, and if you're walking for 30 plus minutes, you'll start to feel that your traps might get a little bit more sore, right? And then once you get there, then you might consider investing in a more robust backpack. So as a general rule of thumb, if you were working up to about 20 to 25% of your body weight as a weight, once you've got some tissue tolerance and you've done this for a bit, that could be a good amount. More isn't necessarily better. What I like when I'm rucking is that at the same pace that I walk without a backpack, my heart rate goes up higher with a rucksack, right? The more resistance training. So I can get into a more moderate intensity, or let's say a zone 2 intensity with a rucksack at the same pace walking that I can without it. So now I'm getting the cardiovascular benefits that I wouldn't otherwise have gotten from walking unless I was walking at a very fast pace. And normally if I walk at that pace, people think something's going on and they want to know what I'm walking away from. Yeah, or something. Just like he's walking really fast, but he's not running. What is he hiding? But anyway, the weight portion of it, yeah, I think from a, if you get to that point where you feel like your traps are getting sore, you've overdone it. Just back off a little bit, build up some more tolerance, and then get back into it.
That makes good sense. And that's a good recommendation. And it's easy to start. I mean, you don't even need to have free weights at home. You could find something that weighs about 5 pounds, throw it in a backpack and go for a walk, right? What I like about walking is it touches on one of the pillars that you chatted about in terms of stress management. I think walking is a really good way of unwinding. And there's been many days, admittedly, John, he loves to walk. He could walk all day long. And I was never really a walker until we were together. And now he loves walking the dogs. We have two dogs. And so you have to walk them, which is good. But I didn't realize how much I enjoyed it in terms of stress management, just walking through paths. And it, you could get home like a big ball of stress and go for a walk and you feel so much better. So I do appreciate that piece, but I do understand what you're saying in terms of intensity. It's beneficial on so many fronts, but if you have a trail that is intense, with some hills and valleys, and you've got a good little cadence going, it could be a good little cardiovascular workout, but just sauntering along is probably not not as much. Yeah.
But I think it's important to also distinguish the difference between what constitutes as exercise and what is stress relief, right? And often exercise can relieve stress, but not all stress relieving activities are exercise. So when you look at walking, I think I wouldn't say don't walk because it's not counting as exercise. I think that's something that could easily be misconstrued, because it's, especially when we look at older populations, right? Mobility, the ability to move is so important, getting from one place to another. And sometimes that just walking, right? If you train to maintain, I think if you look at it from, if you stop moving, right, eventually you're going to stop being able to move. It's not that you stop being able to move that because you get older. You get older because you stop moving to an extent. And, I think, there's a bit of play on words there, but the idea is if you can just keep walking and keep moving in general, don't stop doing that. I think my comments on intensity is if you want to help improve cardiovascular fitness, strength, so muscle mass, bone density, then there has to be a certain amount of load and intensity applied to the exercise itself that walking on its own just does not provide.
Right. And that's fair. One concept I wanted to touch on is that, in the past, many years ago, we focused a lot on wanting to be skinny, right? Women wanted to be skinny, not bulk up, if you will, right? The thought of weight training felt very intimidating because we didn't want to look like men. We don't want to look all bulky. And it's next to impossible for a woman, really, unless you're focused solely on weight training for the purpose of, being in a fitness competition to have, the amount of musculature that a man would have, because we're just not built that way and genetically not able to in a natural way anyway. But I just wanted to touch upon how we've gone away from the idea of being skinny is better, which is refreshing, and more so to a paradigm of being strong, right? That is the focus of strong longevity, health, and wellness versus being skinny and an aesthetic appearance, right? And I really appreciate that, especially being, a mom of a young teen girl, really focusing on that mindset versus, again, that skinny concept, because I think with that, it's dangerous in many ways, but more so trying to get away from it and focusing on, you eat well, you eat lots of protein, it's good for you. And you know what? Lifting weights is good for you. You're not going to look like a man, and if you want to, that's okay. There's ways around that and you can achieve that. But a typical woman who goes in and starts lifting weights and follows a guided plan by a professional in particular, you're going to look lean, you're going to look well, and you're going to be strong, which is the most important part of it all, right? Again, focused on that longevity, that quality of life versus just wanting to be aesthetically skinny, because skinny doesn't equal health. It's low body mass, not a lot of muscle, and thinning bones, which is a recipe for disaster, right? So if you could just comment a bit on that whole paradigm shift and what you've seen in terms of in your world in the fitness industry. And that's really what you guys focus on, which is so commendable.
Yeah, no, you're right. So from an aesthetic standpoint, the industry has shifted a little bit. And I think to look at it from a for broader context, there's three reasons people train, generally speaking. One is performance. So let's say you want to get faster, you want to get stronger, you want to increase your cardiovascular fitness. One is wellness. You want to feel better. There's the lines get blurred a little bit here, but more the subjective nature of it. And then the third one is aesthetics. So how people perceive their appearance. And those three factors are the reasons why people come into the gym initially. And whether or not someone has a specific goal, those are sort of the three areas that are covered. The biggest shift has been that aesthetics, and that it always is. If you look at trends, even in the past 20 years, low fat, high sugar, high fat, all of these things that sort of, it's almost cyclical in nature. Part of that's just, how studies are interpreted and promoted in media. But, it's also pop cultures, in North America, being a very skinny frame now it's changed. That strong concept has definitely has taken over, which is great because that falls more in line with health span, right? Being stronger. So, and as you said, you hear it a lot more. So for instance, I'm someone who puts on muscle really easily. That's why I don't strength train. My clothes fit tighter. They're usually, the thing is that someone who says that might, but a lot of it is, it shouldn't impact why you strength train, right? There should be if the goal is to, let's say, decrease your weight or be slimmer in appearance, eliminating strength training is not the answer to that. We talked about what's outside of the gym could be the answer to that. If you are strength training and decreasing the amount of food or the type of food that you're eating, that can contribute to that. That I think anyone who says that now, and I'm going based on what I believe. Anyone who says that in their 20s, early 30s, which is probably the time frame someone has that concept, when they get into their 60s and 70s and they aren't able to go upstairs or carry things like they used to, I think they'd probably take back that comment in exchange for being able to do those things. So I think it really is a time and place comment that it's still around. And I think the way that we look at it, or at least the way that I look at it, is not to tell someone they're in the wrong for wanting to look a certain way. It's pointing out what they're missing out if they don't strength train in the long term. Mm-hmm. So I understand that from an appearance standpoint, you want to look a certain way, but let's look at function down the road. And I think this differentiates a lot of facilities and philosophies. If you are a physique competitor and your livelihood is looking a certain way, then you have to train a certain way. So we often use the phrase, we're training life athletes, people who are training for life. And one of those things is we want current wellness. And I think one important, you touched on this, is that fitness should never sacrifice health. And I think it was Dr. Doug McGuff who coined this term. But you shouldn't be exercising to a point where you're constantly hurting, right? Because that's where you might increase your fitness, but if it sacrifices health, then what's the point? Mm-hmm. And I think the inverse is true as well. If you aren't exercising enough and it sacrifices health, then you need to increase your exercise. And that exercise in this context is strength training. So when you look at it down the road, from a health span perspective, not strength training now because you're concerned about your appearance is just going to hurt your ability to function later in life.
Well, and there are so many factors, as you've pointed out, right? Genetics is a huge part of it too. There are some people that are just intrinsically very small, right? And lean, and you look at their parents and they're exactly the same. But it's about that mindset that I find so refreshing, that again, the message is strength, right? Strength in whatever capacity your body can tolerate, right? So if you're somebody super lean and you may not have a ton of visible muscle, but you're strong, that's great. That's amazing. But focusing again on not, trying to get to the point where it's unhealthy. It's all mindset. And there's so many factors, so many bits to that. And again, we don't have time to get into this today, but the whole concept around the visceral fat issue too, with trying to maintain low visceral fat, because that's really what ages us and, contributes to cardiovascular disease, except, and, oftentimes in very lean people who maybe don't have the best dietary choices or make the best dietary choices, we actually see that they still have quite a bit of visceral fat despite their external appearance, makes them seem very, very thin. So there are so many bits and pieces to that. And again, we'll talk about that with Dr. Fallis, but it's quite fascinating. And again, it's exciting for me as, the message getting out there, especially being somebody who's so passionate about women's health, the mom of a young teen girl, it's exciting that we're heading in that direction, but also appreciating that, we are metabolically very different than that of men. It's just the reality of how we are built. And that, through some good, small, I think achievable changes, we can be very strong and healthy for forever, right? And again, with the goal being, you can carry your groceries upstairs, you can go and get your groceries, you can walk around without needing assistive devices to do those things, to prevent that of falls so that we can enjoy our life, right? That is the true goal. So talking a little bit about shifting the conversation into nutrition, because you did mention that, again, one of the pillars that you really like to focus on is that of protein intake. That is such a challenge for women. I find, and all the women that I chat with, they say, oh my gosh, I try to get so much protein in, and I'm at maybe 50 to 60% of my goal for the day, and I am stuffed. Like, I can't possibly get any more protein into me. Or the thought of eating more protein is just, not really sitting well, because they're, again, the focus is constantly this protein intake. We know that, as you mentioned, it's about 1 gram of protein for that goal weight, that lean body mass goal weight that a woman would have. Now, that said, in some cases you're getting, between 100 and, 180 grams of protein in your diet per day. That's a lot of protein, right? So give us some tips and tricks on how we can get, maximum amount of protein. Because again, protein is not all protein is equal, right? There's good quality proteins. There's not so good quality proteins. There's proteins that absorb easily. There's others that don't. There's some that cause a lot of satiety, so making us feel very full, very quick. How can we sort of navigate that? I know that's a big topic to try to,
yeah. So if I were to
summarize, but
yeah, no, it is challenging. And having, I think from a societal standpoint, if you just look at so imagine a plate in front of you of dinner, and think of the portions that you have on there. you'd almost think you've got a third of protein, let's say a third of starchy carbohydrates, and a third of vegetables. Let's just generalize here. And when you break those down, that's just how we have grown up in North America for the most part, consuming, at least in Canada, consuming food. So the notion of eating more protein and less carbohydrates is kind of foreign. And then the types of foods. So, if we think chicken and steak, and if we look at traditional foods that we've had, it sort of creates these confounds of what is normal to consume. So one of the things we're working against too is not just how protein's satiating and you just don't have the desire to consume more, but it's strange, it's different. And then another part that you mentioned is the quality. So the different qualities of protein, plant-based versus animal-based. And there's so many different areas that can be discussed. And when I talk about where I believe my expertise is in the practical application of this, it's often the analysis by paralysis where someone is overthinking types of protein, where they should be getting it, the different types of foods in association with proteins, as opposed to just trying it, just do it and try it. And I really like to encourage people, you don't have to do this indefinitely, but for a week, just track food that you've gotten. There's a number of ways that you can do this. There's apps, there's pen and paper. And all this is doing, it's not so much about counting calories, that can help, but it's not so much about counting calories. It's just about being able to look back and seeing the food that you eat. Because often what people cite is not actually what their habits are. So someone says, oh, I eat, very healthy. I'm eating enough protein. If that person writes down what they're eating, their perception of what they're eating is often better than what they've actually consumed. So this is a good exercise for anyone to just have better awareness over what they're consuming. And then it also helps baseline. So if you want to see measurable improvement, being able to see what you were consuming before any change is important. A lot of people, as we get into, especially after the holidays, I'm going to change everything I'm doing right now for 8 weeks. And then it's probably you've changed too much and you go back to what you were doing before. So small changes are really important. So the practical element of having 1 gram of protein per pound of target body weight is its simplicity. It's in the simplicity. Yes, there, fiber, whole foods, like there are a lot of other aspects that are important. Mm-hmm. And the way that I look at this is if I tell someone to eat, hey, you should eat more whole foods, you should eat more fiber, you should eat more fruits and vegetables. I've overcomplicated this. And although they might try to do that, there's no real easy way to measure that and therefore manage that. And what I've found with friends and members at Fuel is by giving one simple metric to control, one variable to control, it has this proxy, sort of this positive feedback loop on everything else that you eat. It is, I'm sure you can do it. It's very tough to eat adequate amounts of protein and eat an unhealthy amount of food. So there's a lot. So what I mean by that, and you touched on the satiety of protein. Protein satiating, it makes you feel more full. If you begin to eat more protein, you actually want to eat less of other foods because you become more full. And usually the other foods that you want to eat are ones that aren't contributing to better outcomes. And again, generalizing here, but just by increasing your protein, you find a lot of people actually decrease over time. Initially, there's a slight increase I found because rather than getting rid of the other foods that they're eating, they just increase protein. And now all of a sudden you've got this net increase in caloric intake, which initially can lead to some weight gain. But over time, what ends up happening is it's very tiring to continue to eat at that amount. But if you keep the protein up, you start to decrease other foods. So the practical benefit of doing it is that there was initial concerns about kidney function, potential cancer by consuming too much protein. Most of those have been disproved. It's not, there isn't really most people eating that much protein, there's no problem associated with it. I believe where some of the issues have been is if you are a performance-oriented person and you're doing physique or you're doing strongman competitions and you're really pushing the boundaries. So you can overeat foods just to help. But again, this is where fitness should never sacrifice health, or protein shouldn't sacrifice health. But they're really, from a practical standpoint, the general population is not going to have a concern eating too much protein. The other concern that a lot of people raise is with red meat. When you say protein, it's sort of synonymous with red meat, but the association or the unhealthy user bias let's say, is when you increase red meat, it's often increased not in whole foods red meat, but it's processed red meats, and then the other things that are associated with it. So a lot of these studies looking at red meat are not controlling for the fact that they're also eating, let's say, high saturated fat red meat that's processed, or if it's with a fast food meal along the lines. But I won't get off onto that tangent. I think coming back to the 1 gram of protein per pound of target body weight, it's just a very simple way that helps increase protein intake to adequate levels to optimize protein synthesis or muscle protein synthesis, which is to build lean tissue. The other question is target body weight. So I think it's important to note that target body weight is not your aesthetic appearance target body weight. So if someone weighs, let's say 175 pounds and their goal is to be 150, that's different than saying target body weight. Now that is a target, but what I mean by this is if you look at, so even though BMI has its limitations, the body mass index, if you look at what someone's weight should be based on their height, age, and you could say, here's the high end of what you should work towards. That just gives you a general number of how much protein you can consume. And it's an easy way to get that number. So if someone's target body weight, again, we'll use 150 pounds, then 150 grams. This is a simple way to do that. And it's simple because for both men and women. And there's an argument that, women should probably eat more than men if they're trying to increase muscle mass. But I think, again, if I were to say 0.9 grams or 1.1 grams, it's just not, it doesn't have the same simplicity as 1 gram. And I know this has been preached by a lot of different people. And aside from the clinical benefits to it, I think the practical benefit and how simple it is to track and measure over time is a great tool to help increase protein to an optimal level.
I couldn't agree more, although I did have a mild visceral reaction when you said we should track food, because I have, over the years, I've worked with different trainers who have encouraged that I track food, and I absolutely hated it. It was something that was a lot of work. But one thing I did notice when I was doing that was I pretty well ate the same things. So once you track about a week, it's pretty well the same thing. So taking that time to do that and not necessarily tracking everything that you're consuming, but more so just the protein, right? If that's the focus is protein, I think it's a little easier than saying, okay, now we've got to track, fats and carbs, et cetera. It does make it a lot more complicated. But for this conversation specifically around protein, and again, focusing on that muscle building and protein synthesis, that retention of lean muscle mass on our bodies that protect our bones, understanding how much protein will keep us healthy and well is really important. So taking that time to do that, even if it's a few days, if you're really eating the same thing over and over again, if you can get a couple of days in, easier said than done when you're busy, but really if that's the goal, you can find time to do that, One other really important thing I wanted to mention about the benefits of protein is also, again, with that satiety, so that ability to feel full longer. We know that protein is really important in regulating insulin, and insulin is a huge part of, again, that health span, right? We know that regulating insulin helps with long-term inflammation, which inflammation does lead to aging and cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera, metabolic disease. So protein is a very important component of, our dietary, what we should be consuming in it, from a daily standpoint, not just for, again, that lean muscle mass, but also metabolically. I mean, there's nothing bad about protein, right? It's just, again, something that we've not been taught. And over the years, right? I mean, it was, like you said, that the changes in the messaging around what's healthy, what's not has changed so much over the course of the last 10 years even. But in North America, we have been, there's been moments where protein has gotten a bad rap, and red meat, like you said, has been sort of demonized. And I encourage my patients, I just say lean red meat is entirely safe. Right. Have a variety of things. Have some fish if you can, if that's something that you're into. There's a lot of seafood that is rich in protein and lean in fat, right? So trying to, and it's how you're preparing your food too. It's not just, again, it's the poor meat got the bad rap, but it's really not the meat, it's the chef, right? So it's all about that, looking into that as well. But I think that it's overwhelming to think tracking food long term, but even for a few days, that will give you a lot of good insight into what you're doing. I think chances are you're probably consuming a little more protein than you thought, Can you give me a little insight in terms of the use of protein powders as well? Because I know that that's, again, sort of a quick fix. It's really there's a lot of ads out there that target women in midlife as far as using like lean proteins that way and the use of collagen, et cetera, which from an aesthetic standpoint, we know that powdered collagen is better than taking tablets of collagen. They just tend to absorb better. Liquid collagen is even better. Yes, it's going to give you some protein, and yes, it's going to help with hair, nails, skin, etc. But really, in terms of quality, how does somebody know when they're stepping into a health food store or a grocery store or whatever, what proteins to purchase if they're opting to supplement some of their protein intake with a shake or some sort of supplement that way?
Yeah. So there's a lot. So protein, a lot of protein is manufactured from the same facilities. They're labeled differently. They get put into a different looking tub. But if you look at protein, you want to get protein with fewer ingredients. So whey protein, right, comes in a few different forms. But if we were looking at, depending on, again, digestibility, so people who can tolerate dairy products, there's also different levels of tolerance. So for instance, I do better with an isolate or hydroslate versus a concentrate, right? And there's these words which sound fancy, but essentially it's all going to be digested the same way. So a whey isolate is going to mix better in water or whatever substance. I mean, if you're going to have it in a smoothie every morning, then a concentrate is fine. You can put this, depending on the type, if you need it flavored. So if it's in a smoothie, you probably don't need it flavored, but flavoring is obviously going to add some more elements, whether that's stevia or some other sweetener. And then that's really all you need. Some of them will have, the weight gaining market. So generally for men looking to build muscle, have a whole bunch of either maltodextrin or other carbohydrates put into it. But if you look at fewer ingredients, and that's better. Most of the stuff, when you're getting it in North America, you can't, I don't want to bash Amazon, but it is tough to find reliable sources. There's a lot of people reselling products that are not what's labeled. So if you are going to get a product, you're gambling a little bit more unless you know the distributor on Amazon. But if you get a whey protein isolate, if you want to take a step up, you're going to get grass-fed. But if you want to take a marketing step up, you get New Zealand grass-fed, because in New Zealand, protein sounds much more exotic. Though it's pretty, the standards for cattle in New Zealand are very similar to that in Canada. You're not getting some superhuman product. But if you're getting a whey isolate from a store in Canada, whether it's online or not, as long as you know that the store, you're fine with fewer ingredients. And how you take it's important. If it's unflavored, you can put it in a smoothie, and it's great because then your smoothie will taste like the ingredients in your smoothie. But if it is flavored, then you can have it in water, and it's more convenient. So I would be less concerned. Fewer ingredients, whether it's concentrate, isolate, those are sort of the two main ones that you can get. Isolate's a little more expensive. Concentrate will, if you can digest whey, will be completely fine. And then going into some of the vegan, so pea, rice, protein blends are fine as well. You need a little bit more. They're a little bit chalkier, so they're not as palatable, but they'll be fine too. So from I would say that adding that, it shouldn't be the bulk of the protein that you have in a day. So again, if we use that 150 grams as an example, right, you shouldn't be eating 75 plus grams of whey protein to get it.
Right.
But if we balance that out, it's a great way to hit that total. Personally, that's what I have to hit my total. My totals are higher than that. So getting, let's say 210 to 220 grams of protein, which sounds ungodly. But if you spread it out throughout the day, if you're aiming for, let's say 30 grams per food, not per serving, per meal, then it's much easier to get them. So yeah, try getting the total amount of protein, and then coming back to what you're saying about collagen. I think if you get a whey protein, it's going to include collagen, but collagen is not going to include all of the other amino acids. So having the whey protein means you're getting your complete amino acid complex that is not happening in simply collagen. And I think, in my opinion, the benefits of collagen are overstated on hair, nails, and skin. Not to say that there isn't that collagen is not an important component of those, but by consuming collagen, it's not creating a tangible improvement, right? Now, if you are deficient in protein and you lose the elasticity in your skin, then that's a different issue. But we could also discuss the difference between being deficient, insufficient, and sufficient. So from a protein standpoint, if you make up most of your, as you said, lean whole sources and then supplement with a whey protein, then it'll help hit that adequate amount of protein to have optimal lean tissue production.
That's awesome. And that does simplify things, because it is overwhelming walking into a grocery store or into a health food store. There's, 100
So
different
many.
options and you just don't know which way to go. I tend to buy smaller containers to try. I'm a little bit finicky with flavor. So I find that, sometimes the label looks good and you think, oh, that can't not taste great. And then it's awful. But luckily the kids eat it. So it all works out.
Start small. Try a smaller quantity. You can get them in 300-gram containers sometimes, and then go into, the bulk size ones that you can find, because at that point you're obviously paying less per gram, but you're comfortable. It's a lot of it, I find, because you're going to get the same quality whey isolate in a lot of different brands. It's not that you're going to see a big difference, even if it's marketed as such. They often come from the same factory, probably produced from the same cattle. But the idea is what's sweetening it. Sometimes there's stevia, sometimes there's sucralose, and then it's also the amount. So you often are playing around with what your preference is. If in water, otherwise go unflavored if it's going to be in a smoothie, because then you don't need to worry about those, and just get something that's purely whey isolate, and maybe in an emulsifier, which it's not going to hurt you, but it's going to make sure that you don't open up your container and you've got a big hard clump of protein.
Yeah, that's not yummy. Can you give us a couple of tips in terms of women who are not weight training right now? Maybe they're not active at all, but their goal is to change that over the next, several weeks to months, understanding, of course, the reason being the benefits for women in perimenopause and menopause in particular. Where would somebody like that start? How does she, sort of, first of all, get motivated? Where does she go to get information to start a routine? And if you can comment more so on the most cost-effective way of going around that, because of course we know that, things are not great right now for many people. The economy is terrible. And, the thought of joining a gym perhaps is very costly and not realistic for a lot of people. So what sort of things can we do, on a budget and for women in midlife?
Yeah. So it really, I think, whether it's midlife, early 20s, it's going to come down to your ability, because I know I work with some women who are fitter than most 20-year-olds I know, right? So those women in their 40s who are extremely fit need more than some women who are in their 20s that aren't doing any strength training. If we were to go from the ground up, someone who is not doing any strength training right now, body weight exercises for the first 2 to 3 months are going to suffice. The most important thing is that you're doing something, not that you're looking for the best thing to do. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost in this, is, how is this going to be effective? The second thing is and I know, as you said, sometimes measuring things can be tedious, but it is an important part of measuring progress. And this is why a lot of, that 8 to 10 week period in a New Year's, when people end up dropping off because they either haven't set goals or not measuring what they're currently doing, and they don't see the incremental progress they're making, and therefore they get demotivated. So when you start, it doesn't need to be every single thing that you're doing, but let's just say you're working on push-ups, right? Count the number of push-ups that you can do when you started, and do a benchmark every month. How many can you do in a month? And a lot of people are like, oh, I was only able to do 1. Now I can only do 2. But often they neglect the fact that 1 to 2 is 100% increase, right? That's 100% improvement in your ability. So look at it from a percentage base, track what you're doing. You can start with push-ups scale. They don't need to be from the floor, do them from a chair, do them from a couch. And then looking from a lower body standpoint, from squats and lunges, you don't need a lot of weight to get started on those. You can get some volume. So up to 30 reps per side of lunges, if that's what you're doing. You're going to have plenty of opportunity to increase strength. So if you're at home, there are a ton. If anything good came out of the pandemic, it is the number of quality body weight exercise programs that you can find at no cost out there, right?
Online,
Find someone that motivates you, someone who's online that you enjoy hearing them talk about their exercise and what they're doing. And just, as I said, the most important thing is doing it. From one step up, now we're going to add some light weights at home. And I think implementing things as you get better is a better strategy than buying things and working up to them, because you need to build the habit of exercising. So the first part for someone who isn't strength training, it's not the type of exercises they're not doing, it's the fact that they're not doing exercise at all. So once you get to a 2 or 3 month period where you've been consistent, right? And let's say you're starting with 2 to 3 days a week, 15 per day. Okay. It's less than an hour a week. And although it's probably not ideal down the road, this is what's going to get you started. And don't overlook the long-term effects of compounding habits. So habits are going to be both good and have good and bad consequences depending on what they are, right? So what you do repeatedly is going to have the biggest impact. And it doesn't matter how small or insignificant it seems, that's going to be a huge opportunity to build some momentum so that when you get into this phase 2, let's call it, now you can say, well, I'm going to invest in, $30 to $50 of some Kijiji or marketplace fitness equipment, which by the way has been flooded. Also another benefit from the pandemic. A lot of people don't use their equipment anymore and they're looking to get rid of it. So looking at the online secondhand market for equipment is a great way to get it. Because most of this, the cost in shipping equipment is your shipping weight.
Yeah.
And shipping costs are based on weight. So if you are able to drive to someone's place and pick up that equipment yourself, that's how you can easily build up some equipment. Then you're just going to take the same exercises that you've been doing and add a little bit of load. And that's from a strength standpoint. Muscular components is, same idea, build up some tolerance. I think I look at it, it's very much, when you say dose dependent, depending on what the individual is capable of doing and what their current habits are and coming back in what's the goal. But right off the bat, 2 to 3 days a week, 15 minutes, if you get into some, and I call them push-up progressions, because a lot of people assume, well, I can't do a push-up from the floor, and that's fine. Don't do push-ups from your knees. And I'll say anyone who knows me knows that doing push-ups from your knees is not doing scaled push-ups. They're push-ups from your knees, because the core component of push-ups are also important. So what you do instead is you do them from an elevated surface. So think an incline, right? If you want to make it easier, you can do them from your bed. You can do them from a table. You can do them from a chair. Work your way down. Once you can get to 10 to 15 push-ups at whatever incline it is that you can do, decrease the incline. So it makes it more challenging. And then phase 3, would be, okay, I'm now exercising, let's say 2 to 3 days a week. Let's say you've increased that now to 30 to 60 minutes on those 2 to 3 days. And then you readjust what your goals are. Is it something else that I need to do? But I think people, for the most part, you can do a lot at home. I think the biggest challenge is staying motivated. So finding some programs that motivate you. And, I think a lot of this comes from the individuals, what they're trying to accomplish. And if you have some goals and you know what you're trying to work towards, then you've got a reason to do it, not just aimlessly working out, because that often leads to demotivation.
For sure. Those are great tips and attainable, right? It doesn't feel overwhelming when you're thinking, okay, 15 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. I think anyone could carve out 15 minutes. And especially if you don't have to get in a car and drive 20 minutes to a gym or whatever it is,
Doing it at home. And I think, one other thing I've omitted there is the intensity is, you don't necessarily need to, if you're someone who loses count of reps, it's a term called reps in reserve or RP, rate of perceived exertion. As long as you are moving to a, let's say 9, if you could perform 10 total reps in push-ups, as long as you get to that 7, 8 range, then you are doing enough to either maintain or increase strength. So you just want to get to a point where you can't do 1 or 2 more reps, because what that does is it puts you in a range that's safe. Because once you get to, I'm trying to do my last rep, then your form breaks down, right? But at that point, the benefit of strength has already been attained. So now you're increasing the risk of injury and not really increasing more benefit of strength. So let's say for someone who's just starting out, going 2 to 3 reps in reserve, which means you could probably do 2 or 3 more reps if you really wanted to. Okay, which means 1, it doesn't feel as challenging, right? But you're still getting an intensity that allows you to increase your strength. And I think that's something that a lot of people think is, I have to feel terrible when I exercise to get better. And that's not necessarily the case. And this is why measuring these things over time helps motivate you, because you realize if you could do 10 push-ups and you're doing 7 or 8 consistently, you will get stronger, right? Because then eventually you'll be able to do 11 and then 12. And now all of a sudden the 7 to 8 becomes 8 and 9, and you move up and scale that way.
That's amazing. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. Again, it's being mindful of your body and what you're feeling during that exercise and saying, okay, I'm achieved, change here. Like I've been able to do 1 or 2 more. That's great. Always wanting to increase more, but understanding that if your arms are falling out from under you.
Yeah. And that progress is not linear, right? Like you are going to some days be worse than others. Some days you're going to not feel like working out, and it's fine if you skip that day, right? Maybe you do it the next day. The consistency is important, but you have to recognize that you're not going to feel better. In fact, if you're feeling better every single day, you're probably not doing enough. there are days that you're not going to feel great, and that's okay. There's going to be times that you go on vacation and you completely go off the rails, which is also okay. So, recognize that it's not just a continual improvement over time. You're going to see some peaks and valleys, and definitely a lot of valleys.
Well, exactly. But again, it's that consistency over the months, right? That once you get into that like rhythm and routine, that week vacation where you're indulging and not working out as much, and your exercise is walking on a beach, which is also super relaxing,
That's the exception and not the rule.
Right. It's not going to impact your overall wellness as well, right? Because you've built all of that other muscle and
exactly.
activity into your lifestyle, which is important. So I love this. It's super motivating. I know it's motivating me because it's a new year, and I need to get my butt in gear as a 42-year-old gal, but easy and attainable things to do. And again, it's small little bits. When you break things up into little bite-sized pieces, they are so much more it's easier to incorporate into your lifestyle and to make it more of a true lifestyle change versus just a fad, right? So
yeah, exactly.
That's exciting. Well, I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast, Greg. Honestly, it's been such a good chat. I always learn a ton when we chat about anything health and fitness. So it's fantastic. And you are actually the first male interviewee or guest of the Hot Flash Diaries podcast. So I'm really, really pumped for that. Yeah, stay tuned for our next episode with Dr. Follis, where we're chatting a lot more about lifespan and health span and how those two differ. Again, just building on this conversation today, but also, how to support a woman going through perimenopause and menopause as a man, because that is a really important piece too, right? And a lot of men don't really, obviously, they don't go through it. They go through it in different ways. So we really want to chat about that in future episodes. So again, thank you so much for coming on today. And I wish everyone who's listening a fantastic day.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. It was great.
Thanks again.